Hi everyone, welcome to the next video in our series of basic macro photography equipment and the very basics of how to use it. We're done with these reverse mount rings, so we're going to move those over here. We're going to bring in two cameras, Minolta SRT-102, the Pentax H3V. Picked this because it's got the Minolta mount and this because it's got the M42 mount, and I happen to have an M42 macro tube set and a Minolta macro tube set. And I've picked these. We're going to do the M42s first because they're mechanically simpler, because they represent two different ways of, two different types of macro tubes. So the macro tubes basically are extenders, and as you'll remember from my previous video, the further away from the film plane the lens is, then the more magnification you'll get with your macros. So these macro tubes, there's three of them. A short one, it's skinny, a medium one, so it's like baby bear, mama bear, and papa bear basically, right? These are very simple. They're metal tubes with a male screw on M42 screw on one end and a female M42 screw on the other. And they cost me, they were free actually because the seller I bought them from on eBay made a mistake, but they would have been about $5 or $6 including shipping, so they're a pretty cheap option, but only work for M42. And the way that they work is you just take your camera. I've used an M42 camera here for simplicity, but if you have a camera with an M42 adapter, that works as well. Sorry about that loud noise. So what you do is you just screw the macro tubes onto the camera. I should rehearse these. It's like amateur hour around here. I should rehearse these things. Anyway, so in theory, the macro tube simply screws in. Maybe that's all the further it goes. Okay, so I should also use this equipment before I start talking about it. So the macro tube screws in. Here we go. Now we screw the lens onto the macro tube. And what happens is the lens is moved this far away from the body, increasing magnification. Because basically, the light enters here and it projects out the back of the lens in a cone. So from the back of the lens to 45.46 millimeters, I think that's what it is. That's the flange focal distance from the flange here on the M42 to the film plane. So increasing that, in this case about doubling it, increases the spread that the light cone has time to make before reaching the film plane. So what was a relatively small portion of the light cone has increased to be a larger portion of the light cone on the film plane with the use of the macro tube. There are some disadvantages to this. It reduces your f-stop. So if you're taking a macro at f2, let's say, you might only have the same amount of light as in f5.6, but the same depth of field as f2. And the reason is because there's less light being concentrated on the film plane. So it's much more difficult to meter this way than with other methods. But if you've got a DSLR, you can just chimp it. Don't worry about it. But if you're not using a DSLR, then you've got to know how to compensate for that light loss, and that is outside the scope of this video, so we're not going to go into it. Now, it's the second I'm putting my K-mount adapter back on this, because this is one of the lenses I use with my DSLR often. Set that over here because we're done with it. These are my Minolta macro extension tubes. By comparison, they're a little bit, well, they're a little bit longer than these M42s, and substantially larger and beefier. And the reason is because these Minoltas have, let's see if I can, here we go. These Minoltas have an aperture control. So this allows the camera to know what aperture the lens is set at when it's mounted on the front of them. So I'm going to take this Celtic 50mm off. I'm going to put all three of these on at once. There we go. So what's happened is the amount of space that the light cone has to spread has increased this much. This is a lot of magnification. And I can tell the camera what my aperture is, and what will happen is that this camera having through the lens metering, the H3V has no meter, but this having through the lens metering, it knows how much light is hitting the film plane and what the aperture is, and then will tell me what the correct shutter speed is. That's the advantage of having the meter coupling on the macro tube.